Before we dive into one of the most defining moments in American history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is a story of endurance, sacrifice, and the birth of a nation forged in the frozen hell of Valley Forge. When Washington was finally joined by troops from the Northern Army, a clamor arose for the capture of Philadelphia. Protected by the Schuylkill and the Delaware, the city could be approached only from the north, and on that side a chain of 14 redoubts extended from river to river. Moreover, the army by which it was occupied, having been reinforced from New York by more than 3,000 men, exceeded 19,000 soldiers. 4 American officers voted in council for an assault upon the lines of this greatly superior force, but the general, sustained by 11 others, disregarded the murmurs of Congress and rejected the mad enterprise. With quickness of eye, Washington selected in the woods of White Marsh strong ground for an encampment, and there, within 14 miles of Philadelphia, awaited the enemy, of whose movements he received exact and timely intelligence. On the severely cold night of the 4th of December, the British, 14,000 strong, marched out to attack the American lines. Before daybreak on the 5th, their advance party halted on a ridge beyond Chestnut Hill, 11 miles from Philadelphia, and at 7, their main body formed in one line with a few regiments as reserves. The Americans occupied thickly wooded hills with a morass and a brook in their front. Opposite the British left wing, a breastwork defended the only point where the brook could be easily forded. At night, the British force rested on their arms. Washington passed the hours in strengthening his position, and though, according to Kalb, who was present, he had but 7,000 really effective men, he wished for an engagement. Near the end of another day, Howe marched back to Germantown, and on the next day, as if intending a surprise, suddenly returned on the American left, which he made preparations to assail. Washington delivered in person to each brigade his orders on the manner of receiving their enemy, exhorting to a reliance on the bayonet. All day long and until 8 in the evening, Howe kept up his reconnoitering, but found the American position everywhere strong by nature and by art. Nothing occurred but a sharp action on Edge Hill between light troops under Gist and Morgan's riflemen and a British party led by General Gray. The latter lost 89 in killed and wounded. The Americans lost 27, among them the brave Major Morris of New Jersey. On the 8th, just after noon, the British suddenly marched by the shortest road to Philadelphia. Their loss in the expedition exceeded 100. The rest of the season, Howe made no excursions except for food or forage, and Washington had no choice but to seek winter quarters for his suffering soldiers, while Gates, with Conway and Mifflin, formed a cabal to drive Washington into retirement and put Gates in his place. Military affairs had thus far been superintended by a congressional committee. After some prelude in July 1777, it was settled in the following October to institute an executive board of war of 5 persons not members of Congress. Conway, a French officer of Irish descent, had long been eager for higher rank. In a timely letter to Richard Henry Lee, a friend to Conway, Washington wrote that his merits exist more in his own imagination than in reality, that it is a maxim with him not to want anything which is to be obtained by importunity, that his promotion would be a real act of injustice likely to incur a train of irremediable evils. To sum up the whole, Washington wrote that he had been a slave to the service, had undergone more than most men are aware of to harmonize so many discordant parts, but it will be impossible for him to be of any further service if such insuperable difficulties are thrown in his way. Conway breathed out his discontent to Gates, writing in substance that heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it. The correspondents of Gates did not scruple in their letters to speak of the commander-in-chief with bitterness or contempt. "This army," wrote Reed, "notwithstanding the efforts of our amiable chief, has as yet gathered no laurels. I perfectly agree with that sentiment which leads to request your assistance." On the 7th, Mifflin, leaving his office of quartermaster general, of which he had neglected the duties yet retaining the rank of major general, was elected to the Board of War. the injurious words of Conway having through Wilkinson been made known to Washington. On the 9th, he communicated his knowledge of them to Conway and to him alone. Conway, in an interview, justified them, made no apology, and after the interview reported his defiance of Washington to Mifflin. On the 10th, Sullivan, knowing the opinion of his brother officers and of his chief, and that on a discussion at a council of war about appointing an inspector general, Conway's pretensions met with no favor, wrote to a member of Congress that no man can behave better in action than General Conway. His regulations in his brigade are much better than any in the army. His knowledge of military matters far exceeds any officer we have.
If the office of Inspector General with the rank of Major General was given him, our army would soon cut a different figure from what they now do. On the same day, Wayne expressed his purpose to follow the line pointed out by the conduct of Lee, Gates, and Mifflin. On the 11th, Conway, foreseeing that Gates was to preside at the Board of War, offered to form him a plan for the instruction of the army, and on the 15th, to advance his intrigue, he tendered his resignation to Congress. On the 17th, Lovell of Massachusetts wrote to Gates, threatening Washington with the mighty torrent of public clamor and vengeance, and subjoined, "How different your conduct and your fortune! This army will be totally lost unless you come down and collect the virtuous band who wish to fight under your banner." On the 21st, Wayne, forgetting the disaster that had attended his own rashness, disparaged Washington as having more than once slighted the favors of fortune. On the 24th, Congress received the resignation of Conway and referred it to the Board of War, of which Mifflin at that time was the head. On the 27th, they filled the places in that board and appointed Gates its president. On the same day, Lovell wrote to Gates that "We want you in different places. We want you most near Germantown. Good God, what a situation we are in, how different from what might have been justly expected." And he represented Washington as a general who collected astonishing numbers of men to wear out stockings, shoes and breeches, and Fabius affairs into a very disagreeable posture. On the 28th, Congress, by a unanimous resolution, declared in favor of carrying on a winter's campaign with vigor and success, and sent 3 of its members to direct every measure which circumstances might require. On the same day, Mifflin, explaining to Gates how Conway had braved the commander-in-chief, volunteered his own opinion that the extract from Conway's letter was a collection of just sentiments. Gates, on receiving the letter, wrote to Conway that "you acted with all the dignity of a virtuous soldier." He wished so very valuable and polite an officer might remain in the service. To Congress, he complained that his correspondence had been betrayed to Washington, with whom he came to an open rupture. On the 13th of December, Congress, following Mifflin's report, appointed Conway Inspector General, promoted him to be a Major General, made his office independent of the Commander-in-Chief, and referred him to the Board of War for the regulations which he was to introduce. Some of those engaged in the cabal, which had its supporters exclusively in the North, wished to provoke Washington to resign his place. This happened just as Washington at White Marsh had closed the campaign with honor. The problem which he must next solve was to keep together through the cold winter an army without tents and to confine the British to the environs of Philadelphia. There was no town which would serve the purpose. Valley Forge, on the Schuylkill, but 21 miles from Philadelphia, admitted of defense against the artillery of those days and had more than one route convenient for escape into the interior. The ground lay between 2 ridges of hills and was covered by a thick forest. As his men moved toward the spot, they were in need of clothes and blankets and shoes as well as tents, and were almost as often without provisions as with them. On the 19th, they arrived at Valley Forge with no covering. From his life in the woods, Washington could see in the trees a town of log cabins built in regular streets and affording shelter enough to save the army from dispersion. The order for their erection was received by officers and men as impossible of execution, and they were astonished at the ease with which, as the work of their Christmas holidays, they changed the forest into huts thatched with boughs in the order of a regular encampment. Washington was followed to Valley Forge by letters from Congress transmitting the remonstrance of the Council and Assembly of Pennsylvania against his going into winter quarters. To this reproof, Washington, on the 23rd, after laying deserved blame upon Mifflin for neglect of duty as quartermaster general, replied that for the want of a 2 days' supply of provisions, an opportunity scarcely ever offered of taking an advantage of the enemy that has not been either totally obstructed or greatly impeded. Men are confined to hospitals or in farmers' houses for want of shoes. We have this day no less than 2,898 men in camp unfit for duty because they are barefoot and otherwise naked.
Our whole strength in Continental troops amounts to no more than 8,200 in camp fit for duty. Since the 4th instant, our numbers fit for duty from hardships and exposures have decreased nearly 2,000 men. Numbers still are obliged to sit all night by fires. Gentlemen reprobate the going into winter quarters as much as if they thought the soldiers were made of stocks or stones. I can assure those gentlemen that it is a much easier and less distressing thing to draw remonstrances in a comfortable room by a good fireside than to occupy a cold, bleak hill and sleep under frost and snow without clothes or blankets. However, although they seem to have little feeling for the naked and distressed soldiers, I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul I pity those miseries which it is neither in my power to relieve or prevent. While the shivering soldiers were shaping the logs for their cabins, the clamor of the Pennsylvanians continued, and the day after Christmas, Sullivan, who held with both sides, gave his written advice to Washington to yield and attack Howe and Philadelphia, risking every consequence in an action. On the last day of the year, an anonymous writer in the New Jersey Gazette at Trenton, supposed to be Benjamin Rush, began a series of articles under the name of a French officer to set forth the unrivaled glory of Gates, who had conquered veterans with militia, pointing out plainly Washington's successor. The next year opened gloomily at Valley Forge. To the touching account of the condition of the Army, Congress, which had not provided one magazine for winter, made no response except a promise to the soldiers of 1 month's extra pay and a renewal of authority to take the articles necessary for their comfortable subsistence. On the 5th of January, 1778, Washington renewed his remonstrances. It will never answer to procure supplies of clothing or provision by coercive measures. Such procedures may give a momentary relief, but if repeated, besides spreading disaffection, jealousy, and fear among the people, never fail, even in the most veteran troops under the most rigid and exact discipline, to raise in the soldiery a disposition to plunder, difficult to suppress, and not only ruinous to the inhabitants, but in many instances to armies themselves. I regret the occasion that compelled us to the measure the other day, and shall consider it among the greatest of our misfortunes if we should be under the necessity of practicing it again. Still, Congress did no more than on the 10th and 12th of January appoint Gates and Mifflin with 4 or 5 others to repair to headquarters and concert reforms. While those who wished the general out of the way urged him to some rash enterprise or sent abroad rumors that he was about to resign, Benjamin Rush, in a letter to Patrick Henry, represented the Army of Washington as having no general at their head, and went on to say that a Gates, a Lee, or a Conway would in a few weeks render them irresistible. Some of the contents of this letter ought to be made public in order to awaken, enlighten, and alarm our country. This communication, to which Rush did not sign his name, Patrick Henry received with scorn and noticed only by sending it to Washington. An anonymous paper of the like stamp transmitted to Henry Lawrence, then President of Congress, took the same direction. Meantime, the Council and Assembly of Pennsylvania renewed to Congress their wish that Philadelphia might be recovered and the British driven away. Congress hailed the letter as proof of a rising spirit and directed the committee appointed to go to camp to consult on the desired attack with the government of Pennsylvania and with General Washington. Conway, having vainly striven to alienate Lafayette from Washington and even to induce him to abandon the United States, the Board of War sought to entice the young representative of France by dazzling him with ideas of glory.
In concert with Conway and without consulting Washington, they induced Congress to sanction a winter expedition against Canada under Lafayette, who was not yet 21 years old, with Conway for his second-in-command and with Stark. At a banquet given in his honor by Gates at Yorktown, Lafayette braved the intriguers and made them all drink his toast to the health of their general. Assured by Gates that he would command an army of 3,000 men and that Stark would have already destroyed the shipping at St. John's, Lafayette, having obtained from Congress Kalb as his second and Washington as his direct superior, repaired to Albany. There, the three major generals of the expedition met and were attended or followed by 20 French officers. Stark wrote for orders.
The available force for the conquest, counting a regiment which Gates detached from the army of Washington, did not exceed 1,000. For these there was no store of provision, nor clothing suited to the climate of Canada, nor means of transportation. 2 years' service in the Northern Department cannot leave to Gates the plea of ignorance. His plan showed his utter want of administrative capacity. It accidentally relieved the country of Conway, who, writing petulantly to Congress, found his resignation, which he had meant only as a complaint, irrevocably accepted. Lafayette and Kalb were recalled. Slights and selfish cabals could wound the sensibility, but not affect the conduct of Washington. His detractors took an unfair advantage, for he was obliged to conceal the weakness of his army from the enemy and therefore from the public. To William Gordon, who was gathering materials for a history of the war, he wrote freely that neither interested nor ambitious views led me into the service. I did not solicit the command, but accepted it after much entreaty with all that diffidence which a conscious want of ability and experience equal to the discharge of so important a trust must naturally excite in a mind not quite devoid of thought. And after I did engage, pursued the great line of my duty and the object in view as far as my judgment could direct, as pointedly as the needle to the pole. No person ever heard me drop an expression that had a tendency to resignation. The same principles that led me to embark in the opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain operate with additional force at this day, nor is it my desire to withdraw my services while they are considered of importance to the present contest. There is not an officer in the service of the United States that would return to the sweets of domestic life with more heartfelt joy than I should, but I mean not to shrink in the cause. In his remonstrances with Congress, he wrote with plainness but with moderation. His calm dignity alike irritated and overawed his adversaries, and nothing could shake the confidence of the people, or divide the affections of the army, or permanently distract the majority of Congress. Those who had been most ready to cavil at him soon wished their rash words benevolently interpreted or forgotten. Gates denied the charge of being in a league to supersede Washington as a wicked, false, diabolical calumny of incendiaries, and would not believe that any such plot existed. Mifflin exonerated himself in more equivocal language, and both retired from the committee that was to repair to headquarters. The French minister loudly expressed to the officers from his country his disapprobation of their taking part in any cabal whatever. In the following July, Conway, thinking himself mortally wounded in a duel, wrote to Washington that, "My career will soon be over, therefore justice and truth prompt me to declare my last sentiments. You are in my eyes the great and good man. May you long enjoy the love, veneration, and esteem of these states, whose liberties you have asserted by your virtues." The committee, which toward the end of January was finally sent to consult with Washington, was composed exclusively of members of Congress, and the majority of them, especially Charles Carroll of Maryland and John Harvey of Virginia, were his friends. They discerned at once the falsehood of the rumors against Washington. John Harvey said to him, "If you had but explained yourself, these reports would have ceased long ago." And his answer was, "How could I have thrown off the blame without doing injury to the common cause?"
But in the procrastination of active measures of relief, the departments of the quartermaster and commissary remained like clocks with so many checks that they cannot go.
Even so late as the 11th of February, Dana, one of the committee, reported that men died for the want of straw or other bedding to raise them from the cold, damp earth. Inoculation was for a like reason delayed. Almost every species of camp transportation was performed by men who, without a murmur, yoked themselves to little carriages of their own making or loaded their fuel and provisions on their backs. Sometimes fuel was wanting when, for want of shoes and stockings, they could not walk through the snow to cut it in the neighboring woods. Some brigades had been 4 days without meat. For days together, the army was without bread. There was danger that the troops would perish from famine or disperse in search of food. All this time, the British soldiers in Philadelphia were well provided for, and the officers quartered upon the inhabitants. The days were spent in pastime, the nights in entertainments. By a proportionate tax on the pay and allowances of each officer, a house was opened for daily resort and for weekly balls with a gaming table and a room devoted to the players of chess. Thrice a week, dramas were enacted by amateur performers. The curtain, painted by André, was greatly admired. The officers, among whom all ranks of the British aristocracy were represented, lived in open licentiousness. At a grand review, an English girl, mistress of a colonel and dressed in the colors of his regiment, drove down the line in her open carriage with great ostentation. The pursuit of pleasure was so eager that an attack in winter was not added to the trials of the army at Valley Forge, even though at one time it was reduced to 5,000 men. During the winter, the members present in Congress were sometimes only 9, rarely 17. Of former members, Franklin, Jefferson, John Rutledge, Jay, and others were employed elsewhere, and John Adams had recently been elected to succeed Dean as commissioner in France. The want of power explains the inefficiency of Congress. It proposed in January to borrow $10 million, but it had no credit. So in January, February, and March, $2 million of paper money were ordered to be issued, and in April, $6.5 million more. These emissions were rapidly followed by corresponding depreciations. When the currency lost its value, Congress would have had the Army serve on from disinterested patriotism, but Washington pointed out the quality in human nature which does not permit practical affairs to be conducted through a succession of years by a great variety of persons without regard to equitable interests and just claims. And after months of resistance, officers who should serve to the end of the war were promised half pay for 7 years, privates a sum of $80. The opportunity of keeping up an army by voluntary enlistments having been thrown away by the jealousy of Congress, Washington, in February, in a particular manner, laid before the Congressional Committee of Arrangement, then with the Army at Valley Forge, a plan of an annual draft as the surest and most certain, if not the only, means left for conducting the war on a proper and respectable ground. Toward the end of the month, Congress adopted the advice, but changed its character to that of a transient expedient. It directed the Continental battalions of all the states except South Carolina and Georgia to be completed by drafts from their militia, but limited the term of service to 9 months. The execution of the measure was unequal, for it depended on the goodwill of the several states, but the scattered villages paraded their militia for the draft with sufficient regularity to save the army from dissolution. Varnum, a brigadier of Rhode Island, proposed the emancipation of slaves in that state on condition of their enlisting in the army for the war. The scheme, approved by Washington and by him referred to Cook, the governor of the state, was accepted. Every able-bodied slave in Rhode Island received by law liberty to enlist in the army for the war. On passing muster, he became free and entitled to all the wages and encouragements given by Congress to any soldier. The state made some compensation to their masters. Unable to force a defaulting agent to a settlement, Congress in February asked the legislatures of the several states to enact laws for the recovery of debts due to the United States, and it invited the supreme executive of every state to watch the behavior of all civil and military officers of the United States in the execution of their offices.
The regulation of the staff of the Army was shaped by Joseph Reed, now a member of Congress and of the committee sent to Congress at the camp. Notwithstanding the distresses of the country, the system was founded on the maxim of large emoluments, especially for the head of the quartermaster's department, and for that head, Greene was selected with 2 family connections of Reed as his assistants. The former was to be with the Army. The other 2, of whom one was superfluous, were stationed near Congress, and by an agreement among themselves, the emoluments in the shape of commissions were to be divided equally between the 3. All subordinate appointments were to be made by the Quartermaster General himself, and their emoluments were likewise to be derived from commissions. The system was arranged and carried through Congress independently of Washington, who, though repeatedly solicited, would never sanction it by his approval. Greene was importunate in his demands to retain the command of a division. On that point, Washington was inflexible. After more than another month, the system of centralization was extended to the commissary department. To increase his profits by furnishing supplies to the Army, Greene did not scruple to enter into a most secret partnership with the head of that department, a third partner, not in office, being the only one known to the public. When he was censured for his desire of gaining wealth from his office as Quartermaster General, he offered the excuse that as he made a sacrifice of his command of a division, and so of his chances of glory in the field, he had the right to be compensated by large emoluments. The place of Inspector General fell to Baron Steuben, a Prussian officer then 47 years of age. The high military rank which he assumed without right, but without question, the good opinion of Vergennes and Saint-Germain, the recommendation of Franklin, the halo of having served during the 7 Years' War under the Great Frederick, and real merit secured for him an appointment as Major General. On the 23rd of February, he was welcomed to Valley Forge. He benefited the country of his adoption by introducing into the Army a regular formation and exact discipline, and by establishing a spirit of order and economy in the interior administration of the regiments. Yet there remained a deeply seated conflict of opinion between Congress and the Commander-in-Chief on questions of principle and policy. Washington from the first would have had men enlisted for the war. Congress, from jealousy of standing armies, had insisted on short enlistments. Washington wished the exchange of prisoners to be conducted on one uniform rule. Congress required a respect to the law of treason of each separate state. Washington would have one Continental Army. Congress wanted an army of 13 sovereignties. Congress was satisfied with the amount of power as a helpless committee. Washington wished a union with efficient powers of government. Congress guarded separate independence. The patriotism of Washington took a wider range, and in return, the public affection radiating from every part of the United States met in him. All this merit and this popularity and the undivided attachment of the Army made Congress more sensible of their own relative weakness. They felt that their perfect control over the general was due to his own nature, and that nature could not be fully judged before the end. Nor was it then known how completely the safety of the country against military usurpation lay in the character of the American people. To allay the jealousy of Congress, Washington, on the 21st of April, wrote to one of his delegates that, under proper limitations, it is certainly true that standing armies are dangerous to a state. The prejudices of other countries have only gone to them in time of peace and from their being hirelings. It is our policy to be prejudiced against them in time of war, though they are citizens having all the ties and interests of citizens, and in most cases property totally unconnected with the military line. The jealousy, impolitic in the extreme, can answer no single good purpose. It is unjust, because no order of men in the 13 states has paid a more sacred regard to the proceedings of Congress than the Army. For without arrogance or the smallest deviation from truth, it may be said that no history now extant can furnish an instance of an army suffering such uncommon hardships as ours has done, and bearing them with the same patience and fortitude. Their submitting without a murmur is a proof of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled.
There may have been some remonstrances or applications to Congress in the style of complaint from the Army, and slaves indeed should we be if this privilege were denied.
But these will not authorize nor even excuse a jealousy that they are therefore aiming at unreasonable powers or making strides subversive of civil authority. There should be none of these distinctions. We should all, Congress and Army, be considered as one people, embarked in one cause, acting on the same principle and to the same end. In framing an oath of fidelity for all civil and military officers, Congress, much as it avoided the expression, made them swear that the people of the United States owed no allegiance to the King of Great Britain. The soldiers, serving under one common flag to establish one common independence, and though in want of food, of shoes, of clothes, of straw for bedding, of pay in a currency of fixed value, of regular pay of any kind, never suffering their just discontent to get the better of their patriotism, still more clearly foreshadowed a great nation. The troops of Burgoyne remained in the environs of Boston. As if preparing an excuse for a total disengagement from his obligations, Burgoyne, complaining without reason of the quarters provided for his officers, wrote and insisted that the United States had violated the public faith and refused to Congress descriptive lists of the non-commissioned officers and soldiers who were not to serve in America during the war. On these grounds, Congress suspended the embarkation of the troops under his command till it should receive notice of a ratification of the convention by the Court of Great Britain. Burgoyne sailed for England on his parole. To counteract the arts of the British emissaries among the Indians on the borders of Virginia and the Carolinas, Colonel Nathaniel Gist was commissioned to take into the public service 200 of the red men and 50 of the white inhabitants of the neighboring counties. Care was taken to preserve the friendship of the Oneidas. The American militia of the sea were restlessly active. In the night of the 27th of January, a privateer took the fort of New Providence, one of the Bahama Isles, made prize of a British vessel of war of 16 guns which had gone in for repairs, and recaptured 5 American vessels. On the 7th of March, Biddle in the Randolph, a United States frigate of 36 guns on a cruise from Charleston, falling in with the Yarmouth, a British ship of 64 guns, hoisted the Stars and Stripes, fired a broadside, and continued the engagement till his ship went down. The King of England succeeded but poorly in his negotiations for subsidiary troops. The crazy Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, who ruled over but 300 square miles with 20,000 inhabitants, after unceasing importunities, bargained with the King of England to deliver at his own risk 1,228 men. On their way to the place of embarkation, as they passed near the frontier of Prussia, 333 of them deserted in 10 days, and the number finally delivered was less than half of what was promised. When they arrived at their destination in Quebec, Carleton, the governor, having no orders respecting them, would not suffer them to disembark till a messenger brought back orders from England. To make good the loss of Hessians, the Landgrave of Hesse-Cassel impressed men wherever he could do so with impunity. The heartless meanness of the Brunswick princes would pass belief if it was not officially authenticated. They begged that the Brunswickers who surrendered at Saratoga might not find their way back to their homes, where they would spoil the traffic in soldiers by their complaints, but be sent rather to the British West Indies. The princes who first engaged in the trade in soldiers were jealous of competitors and dropped hints that the states of Württemberg, where Schiller ran the risk of being assistant surgeon to a regiment of mercenaries, would never suffer a contract by their duke to be consummated, that Protestant England ought not to employ troops of the Elector Palatine because they were Roman Catholics. Had officers or men sent over to America uttered complaints, they would have been shot for mutiny. Mirabeau, then a fugitive in Holland, lifted up the voice of the civilization of his day against the trade and spoke to the peoples of Germany and the soldiers themselves. "What new madness is this? Alas, miserable men, you burn down not the camp of an enemy, but your own hopes. Germans, what brand do you suffer to be put upon your forehead? You war against a people who have never wronged you, who fight for a righteous cause and set you the noblest pattern. They break their chains. Imitate their example. Have you not the same claim to honor and right as your princes? Yes, without doubt, men stand higher than princes. Of all rulers, conscience is the highest.
You, peoples that are cheated, humbled, and sold, flee to America, but there embrace your brothers. In the spacious places of refuge which they open to suffering humanity, learn to apply social institutions to the advantage of every member of society. Against this toxin of revolution, the Landgrave of Hesse defended himself on principles of feudal law and legitimacy. And Mirabeau rejoined that when power breaks the compact which secured and limited its rights, then resistance becomes a duty. To recover freedom, insurrection becomes just. There is no crime like the crime against the freedom of the people. When on the 20th of November the King of England opened the session of Parliament, only 3 systems were proposed. The King insisted on a continuation of the war without regard to the waste of life or treasure, till the colonies should be reduced to subordination. Chatham said that France has insulted you, and our ministers dare not interpose with dignity or effect. My lords, you cannot conquer America. In 3 campaigns we have done nothing and suffered much. You may swell every expense, accumulate every assistance you can buy or borrow, traffic and barter with every little pitiful German prince that sells and sends his subjects to the shambles of a foreign prince. Your efforts are forever vain and impotent, doubly so from this mercenary aid on which you rely, for it irritates to an incurable resentment. If I were an American, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop was landed in my country, I never would lay down my arms. Never, never, never. And he denounced the alliance with the horrible hellhounds of savage war. His advice, freed from rhetoric, was to conciliate America by a change of ministry and to make war on France. The third plan, which was that of the Rockingham party, was expressed by the Duke of Richmond. I would sooner give up every claim to America than continue an unjust and cruel civil war. A few days later, Lord Amherst, as military advisor, gave the opinion that nothing less than an additional army of 40,000 men would be sufficient to carry on offensive war in North America. But the king would not suffer Lord North to flinch, writing that there could not be a man either bold or mad enough to presume to treat for the mother country on a basis of independence, sometimes appealing to the minister's personal affection for him and sense of honor, and in the event of a war with France, suggesting that it might be wise to draw the troops from the revolted provinces and to make war on the French and Spanish islands. To Lord Chatham might be offered anything but substantial power, for his name, which was always his greatest merit, would hurt Lord Rockingham's party. And at court, the king lavished civilities on young George Grenville and others who were connected with Lord Chatham. Those who were near Lord North in his old age never heard him murmur at his having become blind, but his wife is the witness that in the solitude of sleepless nights he would sometimes fall into very low spirits and deeply reproach himself for having, at the earnest desire of the king, remained in administration after he thought that peace ought to have been made with America. If this story of sacrifice, endurance, and the forging of a nation moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped American history.